Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover crimes, secrets, and the darker realities hidden behind the image of Soviet order. Today's story is about a Soviet family that became famous for music, then shocked the entire country by trying to escape the USSR through an airline hijacking. It was one of the most dramatic late Soviet criminal cases of the 1980s. Not only because of what happened on board, but because it exposed deep tensions inside a system that wanted to look stable, successful, and in control. The family was the Ovechkins from Irkutsk. The mother, Ninel Ovechkina, had 11 children and had even received the Soviet title, Hero Mother. Her sons were well known locally as a jazz ensemble called the Seven Simians. Time reported that after their father died in 1984, Ninel raised the children on her own, and the band had recently performed in Japan. To many outsiders, they looked like a Soviet success story, talented, celebrated, and publicly respectable. But on March 8, 1988, that image collapsed. According to Soviet press reports, quoted by the Los Angeles Times and Time, Ninel and 10 of her children boarded an Aeroflot Tu-154 flight from Irkutsk to Leningrad. After a stop in Kurgan, the family revealed weapons and passed a note to the crew demanding that the plane be flown to London, described in one report as a capitalist country. Their goal, according to later reporting, was to flee the Soviet Union and reach the West. Including the Ovechkins, there were 76 passengers on board, along with crew and attendants, according to the Los Angeles Times. That made the danger immediate for dozens of civilians. The crew did not take the plane to London. Instead, the hijackers were persuaded that the aircraft needed to land before continuing. The family was led to believe they were heading toward Finland, but the plane actually landed at a Soviet military airfield near Leningrad, close to the Finnish border. By that point, the standoff had become a national crisis. Soviet authorities were now trying to resolve an attempted escape that had turned into an armed confrontation on a passenger aircraft. What followed ended in tragedy. Contemporary reports said the flight attendant Tamara Zharkaya was killed, 3 passengers also died, and 5 members of the Ovechkin family were killed during the final stage of the incident. At least 20 other people were hospitalized. Different reports described a combination of shooting, an explosion, and the storming of the aircraft by Soviet forces. Even by the standards of a country used to secrecy around crime, this case was impossible to hide. That was one reason the hijacking became such a major story. The Ovechkins were not strangers to the public. They were known as musicians, and Soviet media described their hometown as stunned by the news. The contrast was jarring. A decorated mother, gifted children, and a band that had performed abroad were now at the center of a violent attempt to leave the country by force. The case challenged a familiar Soviet narrative, that people who had opportunities and public recognition inside the system had no reason to try to flee it. It also exposed another Soviet weakness: control over movement. For decades, the Soviet state tightly restricted emigration, especially to Western countries. That made leaving legally difficult for many people and turned escape itself into a political act. In the Ovechkin case, the destination mattered. Reports said the family demanded London. This was not just an attempt to avoid arrest or negotiate a better outcome. It was an attempt to break through the border system itself and leave the Soviet sphere entirely. The aftermath continued the shock. Reuters, as carried by the Los Angeles Times, reported in September 1988 that 2 surviving family members, Igor Ovechkin and his sister Olga, were sentenced to 8 and 6 years in prison for their roles in the hijacking. At the same time, Soviet coverage of the case was unusually detailed for such an event. The Los Angeles Times noted that the reporting reflected Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policy, which had begun opening the Soviet media space more than earlier decades had allowed. Even so, the story still arrived framed as a criminal outrage, not as a sign of a deeper crisis inside Soviet life. And that is why the Ovechkin hijacking still matters. It was not only an aviation crime. It was a story about pressure inside a closed system. A family that appeared to embody Soviet achievement instead tried to leave that system in one of the most desperate ways imaginable. Their case revealed how badly the image of Soviet order could clash with private motives, personal frustration, and the desire to go somewhere the state did not want people to go. It also showed the limits of control. The USSR could control press coverage, passports, borders, and public narratives, but it could not fully control what people wanted, feared, or dreamed about beyond those borders. And by 1988, that contradiction was becoming even harder to hide for Soviet officials, journalists, and the watching public. The Ovechkin family did not become famous because they successfully escaped. They became famous because their failed attempt exposed something larger than one crime. It exposed the human pressure building inside a system that restricted movement, managed information, and made escape politically explosive inside the Soviet system itself. In that sense, this was not only the story of a hijacking. It was also the story of a country confronting the fact that some of its own citizens were willing to risk everything to get out. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried tensions, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.